Welcome dear students. As we are talking about basics of English literature, today I'll be guiding you about major genres of literature. For beginners of English literature, it is imperative to be familiar with major genres and their characteristics so that they may be able to differentiate between these genres and have a sound understanding of how one genre or type of literature differs from another and what are their distinguishing characteristics. Let's move on to the introduction of today's discussion. Here I'll be introducing you to major genres of literature, talking about their definitions and a few examples to do away with any confusions that you might have in relation to them. The objective of today's lesson is that with a clear understanding of existing categories of literature, students will be able to recognize essential characteristics of these different types and then afterwards place individual works in relation to others of the same kind. So as I said earlier, it will allow you to be familiar with the bones of different types of literature. It will help you develop basic knowledge of what these different types are and how they differ from each other. So let's talk about genres of literature. Genre is a French word which means kind or type. Now, we use this term for different types of literature. For example, drama is one genre of literature, poetry is another, prose is yet another, and so on. Now, when we talk about these genres, we have basically several criteria to define these genres. First of all, we define them on the basis of their internal or aesthetic characteristics, traits or features which are found in these works. Secondly, their features of construction, composition, function or mode of expression are also helpful to define them. And the second criterion, the external relationship of the work to real life, how it relates to life at large. So in that context, we look at the subject matter and theme, the major ideas and issues that the writer has addressed in that particular work. So these are basically two criteria: internal or aesthetic characteristics of a certain work and then its relationship to life, how it portrays life. For example, in order to understand this idea, let me offer you an example. If we talk about novel, it refers to the general form or composition of a work, how it has been composed and formed by the writer, which means that it is based on narration and it is different from drama because it has a different composition. Now, within novel, we have subgenres I just want to add this one point here, although I'll be discussing these sub-genres in a separate independent discussion. So further in novel we have historical novel. So when we say historical novel, it means that the novel is based on historical facts or conditions. That is why we associate it with history. For instance, Charles Dickens' novel A Tale of Two Cities is a historical novel because it incorporates, or rather uses, the French Revolution as the backdrop of the story. So we not exactly backdrop, but it is based on French Revolution. It talks about the crises which France went through and how people revolted against cruel and brutal ruling class. So since this novel derives its subject matter from historical facts and events, that is why it is called historical novel. So here sometimes different genres of literature deal with a similar subject. Their subject matter or theme is similar, is common. But since their literary form is different, we categorize them differently. So we use multiple criteria to define a certain work. So a novel, a play, and even a poem may all be examples of social satire or of political protest. Now, since they have the same subject matter, does not mean that they should fall in the same category, in the same genre. But due to difference of composition and literary form, they are categorized differently. So these three genres are significantly different from each other. Similarly, we have another form of another subtype of novel, that is epistolary novel. This is a novel that talks about adolescents entering adulthood. And there is another word that we use for this type of novel, that is Bildungsroman, that talks about a child or an immature person making progress in terms of age and understanding of life. So in this respect, you can have the example of James Joyce's novel The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, in which we have Stephen, the child, becoming adult and mature, not only physically but also intellectually. So that is why this novel will be called epistolary novel or Bildungsroman. Now here we are entering our discussion of major genres of literature. These are three: narrative fiction, drama, and poetry. Now I'll talk very briefly about these three one by one. First of all, narrative fiction. Simply defined, it is a story or meaningful sequence of events with characters and actions so presented that an idea or attitude becomes evident. In simple words, a story that is full of characters and actions explores and discusses certain ideas, certain themes, certain issues. So this idea is called the theme of that work. Narrative fiction is mainly written literature with the exception of folk tales and the earliest epics. Now these two were not written down, rather they were memorized and then recited in front of people. And as far as folk tales and epics are concerned, in our next discussions where I'll be talking in some detail about the sub-genres of these three genres of literature, I'll define them and give you more details of these sub-genres like folk tales and epics. So narrative fiction is meant to be written down for private reading. This is the first distinguishing feature of narrative fiction, that it is written down for private reading, and this is what differentiates it from other genres of literature like drama. The second important factor and defining criterion in narrative fiction is narration, storytelling. Narrative fiction is based on storytelling. We have a voice, we have a storyteller, a narrator who tells this story. So when we have this dimension of narration in narrative fiction, it means that when as readers we are reading and analyzing a work of fiction, we must consider the personality of this storyteller, who then becomes, due to his status as the storyteller, the center of consciousness. His views, his viewpoint, his moral values and attitudes to some extent affect a reader's reception of that work. So we must be careful about his personality, moral values and attitudes. Second main genre of literature here is drama. Drama is the word derived from the Greek word dran or drain, which means to do, to act or to perform. And it signifies that stage presentation, public performance is the basic defining criterion of drama. So it is actually written to be performed on a stage before an audience. Now you can recall one distinguishing feature of narrative fiction that I have just discussed, that it is written down for private reading. You will be able to understand how these two are different from each other. Drama is written for stage, for performance, and fiction is written for reading. But there is one type of drama that is called closet drama. It is written for reading, not performance. And this closet drama is primarily associated with 19th century English literature. Now, another thing that you must understand about drama is that dramatic art, drama is combination of the verbal. Verbal here refers to the use of language. Now, use of language is common to all genres of literature, but dramatic art brings in more elements like non-verbal or optical visual means. For example, stage, scenery, shifting of scenes, facial expressions, gestures, makeup, props and lighting. So these features are not features of fiction. They are only found in drama. That is why we do not only have verbal means in drama, rather non-verbal and optical visual means which are related to our vision. The third main genre of literature is poetry. Now, again, poetry is derived from the Greek word poio, which means to make, to produce, and it signifies that poet is the person who makes verse, who creates poetry. Now, if we look at poetry, it is probably the most difficult genre of literature to define very precisely. But if we consider classical characteristics of poetry, these are verse, rhyme and meter. Now again, these terms need to be explained, and I'll be talking about them in my upcoming discussions. But there is one thing that you must understand in order to avoid any confusion in your mind, that these characteristics do not apply to modern poetry, because modern prose poetry, or what we call free verse, does not have all of these characteristics, but it is still poetry. So that is why I said that these are classical characteristics of poetry, and the critics and scholars have tried to bring in more elements in order to make the definition cover all types of poetry, whether it be classical or modern. So in conclusion, we can say that drama and poetry are meant for public performance. Even poetry is meant to be recited for people. But at the same time, they might also be written down and read privately, as it is happening nowadays. But in ancient Greek, in classical times, drama and poetry were not written down for reading, rather for public performance. So in the next discussion, I'll be talking about subgenres of narrative fiction. I hope you understand this discussion. So if you have any questions or confusions, please try to read more about these things on your own, and you can also contact me for more information. Thank you very much.